Doctor, thank you so much for joining us on the Stop Chasing Pain podcast. It's an honor to have you on the show.
Thank you very much. And as I mentioned, my pleasure to talk to you and to reach your audience. And hopefully we will spread the word about lymphatics and make them more of an issue for many people that never think about those, but may suffer the consequence about it.
Absolutely agree 100%. So any of you that follow me on Stop Chasing Pain, you know I love lymphatics and I talk about it all the time and have my own course in it. And I'm always researching and always learning. The field is changing every day, getting more awareness out to the public and the medical community, which is really wonderful. And I came across Dr. Oliver's work on watching a YouTube video, actually, and then a lymphedema type summit. And it really drew me in and struck me because it's how my brain has been thinking about the role of lymphatics to way more than just lymphedema. Right? Yeah. A lot of other types of conditions, what they call comorbidities. So I'd like to start, Doctor, with how about we start talking about the lymphatic system, a little bit about what it is for those that might not know what it is and what got you into working with that in your research.
Sure. As most people probably know, there are two major vascular systems in our body. I always use the same example. The one that everybody is familiar with, which is the blood vascular system, and the one that is the topic today that very few people, even unfortunately physicians, know not much about it, or they don't pay much attention to, which is the lymphatic vasculature. And in medical textbooks, even the lymphatics is just one page in general, and it's very unfortunate. It's changing, and I will towards the end of this conversation hopefully will become clear. But I think there are a number of reasons why this field was somehow forgotten for some time. So both vascular networks, the blood and the lymphatics, are lined by the same type of cells, which are called endothelial cells. And they form networks of vessels interconnected, and one transport blood, the other transport lymph. And in the lymphatic in particularly, the lymphatics connect through intermediate structures, which are called lymph nodes. And but one of the reasons I try to think why the research in lymphatic didn't progress much, I think there are two reasons. Why, when we started, there were no markers, molecular markers, that allow us to really distinguish a lymphatic vasculature. So this was just done by histology at the naked eye, and this is not easy. So I think that's partially why research in lymphatic development, lymphatic formation, etc., was on hold. And that's how we enter into this field, by a total serendipitous finding, like happens most of the time. We identify a transcription factor, a gene, that turned out to be the first specific marker for lymphatic endothelial cells. So I think that this was over 20 years ago, and this gene is called PROX1. And I think that opened the doors in that regard, because now we have an antibody or a marker that allows us to distinguish these two types of vessels. Also, the time when we started, again, what you can read in textbooks about lymphatics is what most people is aware. So lymphatics were always considered a sewer system, right? So the definition is already pretty bad, if you think about it. Because we all know they do is that basically remove all the garbage that our body collects through the day, including dying cells, fluids, and then they get inside the lymphatics and they are transported back to the blood circulation. And the other very well-known role of lymphatics, obviously, is in the immune response. Basically, they bring immune cells, so that's another well-characterized role of lymphatics. And the final one, the other one is the role of lymphatics in tumor metastasis. The lymphatics and the lymph nodes are well known because that's the main route by which metastatic cells reach the lymph nodes that they are move around the body. And then what the conditions you mentioned at the beginning, which is lymphedema. And lymphedema comes in two flavors, could be inherited and genetic, or unfortunately, it could come as a consequence of surgery or treatments in many occasions, particularly, for example, in women with breast cancer. Normally, one thing that happens is they need to remove a lymph node, and just for prevention. And what does because you remove the lymph nodes, therefore you remove the lymphatics that are attached to the lymph nodes. Therefore, those lymphatics do not function properly in the arm, for example, and therefore they swell. And swelling is a classical phenotype or observation of lymphatic malfunction. The liquids are not absorbed, and therefore you have swelling. Sometimes it's in the genetic forms of lymphedema is unilateral. The legs could be really swollen, or an arm is very painful. There are no treatments yet. It's just basically massage, and that's pretty much what it was known of what it is. And there is a lot of people that suffer from many ways of lymphedema. But that's what I define the symptomatic, well-characterized roles of lymphatics. That's what the textbooks talk about. It. That's what we all know. And I think in the last decade, the investigation of lymphatic has really changed. And from being, as I said, almost forgotten, now is an extremely hot topic. And I will discuss during this time about a number of diseases that has been linked to asymptomatic, in many cases, lymphatic malfunction. And so, bottom line, as I said, I'm a developmental biologist. I'm not a physician. And I love developmental biology. I think it's a fantastic field. Sometimes people forget, but all this work about stem cells, organoids, depends on development, classic experiment from developmental biology. So, and that's how we started. We were trying to identify genes that are required for the development of the brain. And eventually we ended with this gene I mentioned at the beginning that has turned out that had not much to do with brain development, but has to do with lymphatic formation. So as I said, this gene PROX1 was the first marker, but probably the most exciting result that this gene turned out not just to be a marker, but turned out the first gene that if you remove it, you delete it, you inactivate it, the embryo is totally devoid of lymphatic endothelial cells. So this was the first animal model that completely lacked lymphatics. So these embryos die, these are mouse embryos, they die at mid-gestation. In mouse, the gestation lasts 20 days, they die around E14 and a half. And it was evident. You look under the scope and you see these embryos are totally swollen, the skin, typical lymphatic malfunction defects. And it was amazing. When we started to look, we noticed that there was no lymphatics whatsoever. That was probably a big game changer. Wow. Because now we have a marker for lymphatics. And now we have a model, or we identify a gene that is critical, its function, for the formation of lymphatics. So for me as a developmental biology, this opened the door of trying to understand, okay, how do lymphatics formation happens? We all knew more or less how blood vasculature formation takes place. Right? This is more or less well characterized. But about lymphatics, all what was known was some papers from almost 100 years ago. 1902, 1910, by my favorite one, by a remarkable woman named Florence Sabin. And this woman was not just a remarkable scientist, but a remarkable character. She was the first American woman into the National Academy of Science, the first woman into Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. So she fought to stop discrimination, human rights. She was an amazing character. And imagine the early 1900s, being a woman scientist was not easy, as still is not today. But and basically her major contribution at the time was by injecting ink into pig embryos. She proposed how the lymphatics form. She proposed that they derive from the veins, and then there was another group that was quite nasty toward her, of males, basically Huntington and McClure, that they proposed an opposite model. Anyhow, but basically we are in the early 1900s, and then we jump all the way to almost 1999, 1996, in which a colleague of mine, the group of Kari Alitalo in Finland, they identify a growth factor called VEGFR3 that they argue that probably was involved with the lymphatic vasculature. And then we jump to our paper with the identification of PROX1 in 1999, and showing that this was the first mouse model devoid of lymphatics. So we have a 100-year gap. Mm. And pretty much that's how I would say this field started. So my group and a lot of other groups around the world became interested in the topic, not only in the mouse, there's a lot of work in zebrafish, also in chicken, and there are similarities, some differences, but many things can be shared. And work from all this group really allow us to clearly characterize all the different steps and genes required for the formation on a fully functional lymphatic network. There were plenty of surprises along the way. Now we have a huge community of lymphatic researchers. A lot of conference. So the first conference we have on lymphatics, we couldn't fill the auditorium. Now we are always.
Bet you will now. Yeah.
Yeah, we are always oversubscribed. But and I would say I'm really summarizing very quickly a lot of work that, as I said, and still this is work in progress. Although I said we understood much better how lymphatic development takes place, there is still a lot of gaps and things to learn. And but this brought all what I just described is lymphatic development, and this was really important. Sometimes people don't keep that into perspective, that understanding the basic aspects of a problem is critical to understand then what happens when these things doesn't work properly in disease conditions. And the nice thing about all that work, that there were many other genes in addition to PROX1 that were identified that regulate different aspects of lymphatic vasculature formation. And the important aspect, many of those turn out to be later on identified as responsible of different forms of lymphedema in patients. So now we have, for the first time, a correlation of a gene that was found responsible for lymphedema in human beings. And now we know exactly, using a mouse model or a zebrafish, what does it do? What aspect of lymphatic formation is affected by the lack of that gene? And that's really important. So first of all, because now we know many more candidate genes that we can screen in a patient for alterations, but also we know more or less what could be wrong, what aspect would this gene be impacted. And that's where that was, as I said, and this list keep increasing, but unfortunately, we know more about the disease, but still the therapeutic opportunities they are still limited, unfortunately. But then comes, and as I said, all the symptomatic aspects of lymphatics, more or less well known, and people keep studying. But now comes what I became extremely interested and surprised, if you like, which is by the asymptomatic aspects of lymphatics and what you talk at the beginning, comorbidities. And that also, I want to think, comes thanks to the work of a former postdoc of mine, Natasha Harvey, when she was in my lab. Turns out that I told you when we don't have PROX1, we don't have lymphatics. But when you just remove one copy of this gene, what she noticed was that these mice become, with age, very, very fat, extremely obese. And this was very unusual. We were very surprised. We couldn't understand the reason for that. And we characterized the usual suspects that could be responsible, the liver, the pancreas, etc. But turned out nothing of that was making sense. And one thing I didn't mention before, among the things that lymphatics known to do, is lymphatics are the route by which lipids are transported by our body. So as we absorb lipids, they become encapsulated in small particles called chylomicrons, that they are transported by the lymphatics, and then mostly in the intestine, in a part of the gut called villi, there is a specialized lymphatic which is called lacteal. That's from where these chylomicrons, which are transported by the lymphatics initially, go back to the blood circulation, and that's how the lipids are absorbed by our body. So these lymphatics are very special, very important by these chylomicrons as well. Well, when Natasha started to look into these animals and see what happened, one thing she noticed that the lymphatics in these animals were abnormal. They were mispatterned, misrouted, defective, but especially they have holes, they have leakage, they have gaps, meaning the integrity of these vessels was compromised. And what she found was that these chylomicrons that normally should be inside the vessel were leaking out to the surrounding tissue, particularly in the gut. And where she was able to demonstrate that these chylomicron particles in vitro were able to differentiate pre-adipocytes, intra-adipocytes. So to make the story short, what we proposed 15 years ago was that there was another model of obesity beside the classical ones, which is you eat too much, you don't exercise much, genetic, etc. Now, what we were proposing, and I need to add something, these animals were asymptomatic for lymphatics, meaning if you look at these animals, they don't have lymphedema. They look perfectly normal. They are just obese, period. So what we started to think, or what we proposed, that there is a new reason for obesity, which could be asymptomatic malfunction of lymphatics, right? So meaning, and I talk with a lot of clinicians about whether it could be that some group of the population, they don't really have a reason why they are obese. And they told me, yeah, there is a lot of people, we don't have a clue why they are obese. And what we suggested at that time was that maybe this is one. You don't know that your lymphatics are not functioning 100%, but maybe you have a small gap here and there. And what we proposed that this leakage could be one of the reasons why some people become obese. And that's, it took a long time. I must say many people in the community was a little bit skeptical about this idea because it was only one model, one mouse model, nothing else. But as time progressed, more findings started to support this possibility and more animal models. And now the idea that lymphatics play major roles in metabolism and likely in obesity is becoming supported by, as I said, many findings from many other colleagues. And in that regard, the difficulty with lymphatics is that, you know, with the blood vasculature, there are easy ways to somehow evaluate if your blood vasculature is defective. We can measure blood pressure. There are different methods to visualize your blood circulation. But for lymphatics, the assays that could measure, if I'm not talking the ones with lymphedema, I'm talking asymptomatic malfunction. Right. All what you can do is to inject a tracer into this person and look at the lymphatics. But these are pretty invasive and not easy to do assays. And our idea and our goal at that time was, I would love to get access to people which are obese. They don't have lymphedema and they don't know why they are obese. But obviously I cannot just ask people on the street, hey, can I inject a tracer and see how your lymphatics are?
Right.
That will not work. So we started other approaches with a colleague of mine, which runs one of the largest lymphedema clinics in the country, Stanley Roxon at Stanford. And the idea was initially, okay, can we identify some type of biomarker that could be easily accessible in blood or urine that could be elevated in people or in our mouse models that have defective lymphatics. And to make a story short, we also collaborated with a group in Spain. We decided to use blood samples, but for enrichment, we use exosomes, which are particles inside that carry a lot of things, proteins, RNA. And to make the story short, we did this analysis in our obese mouse animals, in other control experiments, and in patients that Stan Roxon collected, which are normal, obese, lymphedema, other forms of lymphatic malformations. And basically, we were able, although the sample number, let me be clear, is still relatively short, but we identified one marker that was consistently elevated in all these. So we have the idea now, at least maybe there is a marker that could be used in a larger cohort of individuals eventually to see if we can find a correlation between asymptomatic lymphatic malfunction and obesity. And why will that be important? Because at least now you will have a different way to diagnose and treat these patients. It will not be the classical stop eating or start exercising, right? So I think there will be different ways to treat with a different diet that will remove certain lipids, which are enriched in chylomicrons and things like that. So anyhow, I try to believe, and maybe this is just a little bit of gratifying for myself, that somehow this finding from Natasha was opened this door to this idea that asymptomatic or lymphatic malfunction may play other roles. And the idea, and this came together with more and more findings that lymphatics do much more than what the traditional functions of lymphatics. So as time passed now, and I'm looking to a review paper we wrote a couple of years ago. Turns out that now lymphatics do many other things than the ones I just told you. So for example, and I don't want to avoid any, sorry, I'm looking into this, here it is. I told you about obesity. Related a little bit with this, now there is idea that lymphatics, there is another disease that is very difficult to diagnose and to treat, which is irritable bowel disease, in particular Crohn's disease. And there is data that is starting to coming up that suggests that maybe lymphatic malfunction could play a role also in this disease. There is another one that has been very well characterized, which is in the eye. There is glaucoma, which is elevated pressure in the back of the eye that eventually leads to blindness. And it was found that in the back of the eye, there is a very specialized vessel, which is a hybrid between lymphatic and blood, which is called the Schlemm canal. And was found that this defects in this vessel is responsible for glaucoma. So there you have another totally unexpected functional role of lymphatics in vision, right? Probably one of a very, very hot topic these days has to do with lymphatics in the brain.
Right.
So it was rediscovered, if you like. Let me be clear, we don't have lymphatics inside the brain. But on top of the brain, where the meninges are, there is a specialized lymphatic called meningeal lymphatics, which has more and more data is piling up that these meningeal lymphatics play important roles in probably Alzheimer's, aging, many neurological disorders, Parkinson's, MS, you name it, a plethora of neurological alterations that could be related to malfunction of these lymphatics. There was a couple of other papers that show also the role of lymphatics in, for example, the regrowth of hair in the skin. And our own work, and this was also work by other groups, they started to accumulate data that, you know, when you have a heart attack, that's not fun. And
Yeah.
the idea until recently was that the major reasons for that was, you know, problems with the blood vasculature, hypertension, you name it. But something that was found a few years ago was that when you have an infarct or an injury in the heart, lymphatics, we have lymphatics on top of the heart. These lymphatics grow or expand into the infarcted area. But more importantly, what was proposed and shown that probably these new lymphatics play an important role in improvement cardiac repair after an infarct. That was also a blow-minding idea that now lymphatics have a kind of therapeutic function in cardiac repair after an infarct. And there have been also a number of papers that started to support this in zebrafish and in mice. And it has been done by using animal models, but also by promoting lymphangiogenesis by injecting virus that can induce lymphatic formation into the heart. And that's what another contribution from my lab came a couple of years ago from Charles Liu, a former postdoc in my lab, because we were curious about this data. And as I told you, we are developmental biologists. And we knew, I told you that prox is important for lymphatic formation. And lymphatics in the heart start to appear around mid-gestation in a mouse embryo, around 14 and a half. What she decided was, what if I remove prox in the heart and see what happens in an embryo? And that was quite striking when she showed me the data, because indeed these animals have no lymphatics. The heart was totally devoid of lymphatics. But what she would show me was that the heart in these animals was 1/3 smaller. And 1/3 smaller for a heart is very important. You will drop dead if your heart is 1/3 smaller. And that was shocking news, because we all know that's well understood that for organ development and organ growth, you need blood supply. The blood provides nutrients, oxygen, you name it. But lymphatics for organ growth, that was never thought about it. Why will you need that? Well, to make a story short, Shirley was able to demonstrate that indeed lymphatics into the heart are critical for cardiac growth. And what she was able to show, it was a lot of work. This was in the middle of COVID. It was not easy, and we were with the revision of the manuscript, that lymphatic endothelial cells obviously produce a lot of proteins and factors. But among those, she was able to identify a secreted factor called reelin. It doesn't matter the name. But she showed that this factor is the one responsible. This factor produced by lymphatics in the heart is responsible for the growth of the heart. She showed that the reason why the heart is smaller is because cardiomyocyte proliferation is reduced and cardiomyocyte cell death is increased in these animals. So bottom line, now we have a new, totally unexpected role of lymphatics, which is they are responsible for organ growth. In this case, in particular of the heart, but we have evidence that this is probably true for other organs as well. And not only reelin, but other factors that we identified from the screening she did at the beginning. This, again, this put a completely, totally never thought idea that not only blood supply is required for organ growth, but you need lymphatics for that. Probably as a backup system. I really don't know what's the reason for that. But that's really interesting and fascinating because also open many doors if you want to think wild. Because, you know, now a lot of labs and companies are interested in organoids. Basically, organoids are organs that you can build in the lab from stem cells or patient-derived stem cells. And you can get a liver, a pancreas, you name it, an eye. And this is becoming very important eventually for therapeutic purposes in the future. But normally, when you do these organoids, they are not exactly identical to the fully mature organ in our body. And one of the ideas is, well, they don't have blood supply. And it's probably correct. But now with these findings, we can also start playing with the idea that adding these factors that we are identifying to see if we can make these organs grow faster, better, whatever. In any case, Charlotte decided this is true for organ development. And there was the data I mentioned at the beginning that lymphatic expansion is important when you have an infarct. She decided to challenge this idea and use this factor to see what happened. And it was, again, very fascinating because what she did initially was take a normal mouse, produce an infarct, and then provide this protein on top of the heart at the moment you have the infarct. And she was able to show by doing that, the recovery, cardiac function after the infarct clearly improved in these animals. So, and the reason why it improved because the number of dying cardiomyocytes, which is a typical feature of an infarct, is reduced pretty much in these animals. So now this really supported these initial results that about novel functions of lymphatics. Now we know lymphatics are also important for cardiac growth and cardiac repair. And I think this is just, and I just summarized what we know today, but I think we just opened the doors. I'm sure every few months we will have another functional role and another functional role. But now comes the part that the first word you mentioned at the beginning, which is what makes me extremely excited about all of these, which is comorbidities. Because now we have many other functions or many other diseases that could be impaired consequence of not symptomatic, but asymptomatic lymphatic malfunction. You don't need to have lymphedema to have all of these. Again, you may have subtle asymptomatic lymphatic malfunction, and that may be responsible for your obesity, glaucoma, Alzheimer's, cardiovascular disease, Crohn's disease, you name it. But how are we going to this? So far we are doing in animal models, but who you move into the clinic? And this is not easy, but I think my colleagues, the clinicians, are the ones that have the doors for that. Because I have been talking quite a bit with them, and many of them are entering into this phase. It's not easy, but if we start, for example, with patients which are symptomatic, let's say patients with genetic lymphedema, we know those individuals have general, in particular the ones that are more general than the one that is localized lymphatic malfunction, they have symptomatic lymphatic defects. So the ideal now will be to really get a large number of individuals and a really broad clinical spectrum to really determine, okay, in these patients, what else is affected? And we know, I mean, my colleagues, the clinicians know that in many of them, there is associated obesity or more cancer or more cardiovascular disease or this. But I think what we need is a very serious symptom and clear database, collecting data from all these patients to see, okay, what other of all these features I just mentioned is associated, or what comorbidities are associated in these patients that could really put a link or confirm these data from animal models. They're saying, yes, in patients that have generalized lymphatic malfunction, you see a trend to have associated with that this and this and this, or are more prone to Alzheimer, this and that. But at the same time, I would love to do it in asymptomatic individuals, right? Which is what I told you at the beginning, collect a large number of individuals that may have some of these features and see what others are associated. And once you narrow that number of individuals, the ones that you suspect that may have lymphatic malfunction, you can try to validate it by just doing, as I said, these typical assays for lymphatic, which is lymphoangiogram, injecting a dye and confirm. And again, what this will imply is the treatment and diagnosis of all these diseases in these individuals will change completely. Because now you will have a better way to think. I'm not going to say, if you know that, it's going to be a piece of cake to treat any of those. No, because still we don't know how to repair lymphatic defects. Let me be clear. But at least you know, well, at least part of the disease may be consequence of that the meningeal lymphatics are affected in these individuals. Therefore, it's not just the plaques, or the plaques could be secondary to the lymphatic defects. Then the idea will be, okay, how do we treat or how can we improve lymphatic function in these individuals? But also maybe the other thing that can provide is easier or earlier diagnostic tools to prevent or detect very early the onset of some of these diseases, because now you don't go for the usual suspects that appear in many cases when it's too late, but you can just do preventive medicine in some of those cases. In any case, I hope I more or less summarize what you asked me to talk about from the beginning, and I will be happy to answer questions. And I'm sure I forgot tons of things, but I think this hopefully will give your audience an idea about lymphatics when they go back to work or do whatever they do during the day. The word lymphatics will remain in their brain, and they will say, oh, well, this is another thing I need to be aware of.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, Doctor, thank you so much for that. I could just sit back and have you talk for a month. You just keep going. I love it. There's so many of the things that you said that resonated with me that I want to kind of pull back on. And the first one is just the awareness of the lymphatics and how much of a role it likely plays from the research you're doing and seeing well beyond just the lymphedema. That's actually one of the things that struck me the most. It was a lot in the presentation, but how you said, you know, people only believe they have a lymphatic system issue, or they should even look at lymphatics only under the guise of what we consider a clinical manifestation of it, which is lymphedema. But, you know, you could have the, I guess, subclinical might be a term, or the asymptomatic. And that's something that really kicked me off, because, you know, so many people are, quote unquote, think that everything is okay until all of a sudden it's not, right? And then all these other issues. But lymph is not on the radar because something's not abnormally swollen. So they just put it to the wayside and dismiss it. A part of it because maybe they didn't have any ways to look at it, like you mentioned before. But, you know, it's just have the awareness of, let's even start to look around in this dark room a little bit and see if it's there, right?
Right. And the important thing also about these is obviously patients affected by lymphedema, they are very well aware of these, and they form a strong community. And there is a society, in particular the Lymphatic Research Foundation, that has been doing a lot for bringing awareness about the lymphatics. And this has been great also because lymphatics were forgotten, and therefore funding for lymphatic research was something that was never great. And thanks to that, now NIH in particular is providing more funds for research in this area. The government as well. There is now crosstalks between the government and the Lymphatic Foundation. And I think that's really important. But again, I as you said, I think this idea that in many of us that we feel, you know, we don't have a swollen of anything that indicates lymphedema, but I always think in myself, you know, for some of the issues we may have, the clinical issues we may have, you know, I became quite aware about lymphatics, and I think myself, well, maybe this is coming back to me, right? So, but again, as I said, at the moment there is nothing I can do towards if that will be the case to treat them. Although let me, at least in the patients with lymphedema, there are certain clinical trials ongoing that eventually may be able to locally promote lymphatic growth and maybe repair the affected areas. Still, we are far from. In the case of glaucoma, there are also clinical trials to really improve vision in these patients. And in Crohn's disease, again, knowing that, for example, lymphatics may contribute, you know, in Crohn's disease, a typical feature is what is called the creeping fat, which is the accumulation of huge amounts of fat attached to the gut, the intestine, and they need to cut that piece of the intestine. But as I told you, we know fat accumulation can be promoted by lymphatics. So at least knowing that, something you can do is just, again, change the diet accordingly to what we know lymphatics are doing. It's just that, you know, it happened in our society with almost every finding and any discovery that eventually impact in the clinic. It's a step by step, one step at a time. And if you think lymphatic history in this regard, modern lymphatics, it has 20 years. It's very short, and we went really far.
Yeah.
Much
Agreed.
farther than what I have ever thought. So I think give us time. And I think progress is happening really, really fast at the moment. But having all these in our network now, that many of these diseases could be consequence of the lymphatics, per se is already a major accomplishment, because we never thought about that. And again, it will take time to figure out eventually ways to diagnose it and treat it, but we are on the right path. I think that's the important thing.
Oh, I agree 100%. Plus, with the technology being able to advance, it's like studying the brain. I mean, more has been found about the brain within the last 10 years than probably the last 200, right? Because
Absolutely,
we can see things that we couldn't see before. And same thing with the lymphatics, and kind of recycling back on some things. I got several here. One, when you mentioned the meningeal lymphatics, I think I told you when we were first corresponding through email that, you know, I've had someone that, you know, I think you've co-authored some things with, if I'm not mistaken, please correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. Jonathan Kipnis. He was on my show talking about the meningeal lymphatics, and what really stood out to me was the direct connection to the peripheral lymphatics, that, you know, you can't separate them just because they end at the head.
No, but many times there are these dogmas that sometimes when you start going back in the literature and thinking, why is this a fact? What is the data supporting that? You start, and there is a paper maybe that somebody published 50 years ago and nobody else challenged. And the idea of lymphatics in the brain. As I said, there are no lymphatics in the brain, but that was the dogma, and nobody reevaluated. And we thank to these tools, for example, in particular, this PROX gene that I mentioned, that so animals that have fluorescent PROX have been created that allow us now to easily see lymphatics in the body. And that was key for example, for what Johnny Kipnis was doing. Because then when they started to look under the fluorescent lamp to these animals, they were able to see that it was, wow, there was something on top of the meninges, and that turned out to be a lymphatic. The same was for the Schlem canal. So yes, I think in many of these cases is rediscovery or rethinking dogmas that sometimes we need to challenge, and we need to be think again from a new perspective on all problems, right?
I'm also very happy that you brought up the relationship to the heart. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this individual, and I hope I get his last name right. I'm never sure if I do. He's a cardiothoracic surgeon who was one of the first surgeons who assisted on the first heart transplant in the United States at New York Presbyterian. It was Gerald Lemole, Lemole. And he talks, he's written several books about lymphatics. And one of the things that he was always tormented was he was astounded by how little role he looked at the lymphatics when he was looking at the heart his entire career. And he said, if there's one thing I would change, it would go back and look at the role of the lymphatics in relationship to the heart. And he says it's the first things he starts to address for people who have heart issues right now. Which is quite fascinating.
I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah.
Glad. Also, just one thing I want to mention, you said about surgery. There is a lot of babies that are born sometimes and diagnosed with serious lymphatic malformations that are life-threatening. And there are a number of amazing surgeons that are doing amazing things to improve the quality of lives of these kids. And there is somebody, a colleague I know in Philadelphia, Mark 16, which is like a magician. I love to see his videos because he shows you how he insert these small, I don't know, instruments to repair a damaged lymphatic. And basically he glued them together. I'm not joking. That's exactly what he does. He glued them together. And it's quite remarkable the improvement you see in those kids, and that otherwise probably they wouldn't have survived. So for many of the things, again, as we know better, there is surgical approaches because that can be followed. But again, as I tell when I give talks at universities and for future trainees, there is never a better time to work in lymphatics than now, because the doors are absolutely open. Whatever question you have and you think is wild and crazy, well, it's not wild and crazy anymore.
Do you find it's kind of cycle back to one more thing, because I know we're getting towards the end and wrapping it up, is that with the irritable bowel IBS or Crohn's, I find that interesting because a substantial, if not majority, of the lymphatics are located in the gut region, right?
Correct. You're absolutely right. That's where we have, for the reasons I told you, that's where the lipid exchange takes place. And lymphatics in the gut are very specialized because that tissue is constantly regenerating, losing cells and getting more cells. And yes, Crohn's disease and IBD is a major problem for a lot of people and never know how to treat it. Crohn's, surgery, but IBD is just a bag. Everything that they don't know how to diagnose is IBD. And then therefore, try this diet, try that diet. But again, in many of these cases could be because of lymphatic malfunction. And now these get associated with the microbiome now. So the microbiome is also started to play major function. And don't
Right.
forget, many of the things are absorbed by the lymphatics. So I think the crosstalk between the intestine, the lymphatics, and the microbiome, we will have major components in all of these. And as I said, I'm not yet, but
Mm.
eventually, once we learn more, how is it happening? Maybe by playing with the diet, with specifically in those patients, it could be really beneficial because we know exactly what type of amino acid, what type of lipid we want to target and remove from the diet or add to the diet to improve their quality of life, right?
Yeah, it's kind of like, okay, the cart before the hearse kind of scenario. It made me think about, a lot of people are trying to go after healing the gut and gut restoration, but they're not doing anything to address the lymphatics. Maybe work the lymphatics, and that'll help your gut restoration program. But which came first, the chicken or the egg? It's probably both. But also about the obesity, because that one was really great because I know that they have obesity as a factor that can lead to lymphedema. That's the way
Correct.
they were looking at it, but now it can flip the other way around,
Well,
right?
not necessarily. I think
No?
it's, if anything, is the other way around. And that
Mm.
was one of the reasons, to be honest with you, why we started to think that lymphatic defect to be the reason of the obesity in our
I
proximal.
see. Okay, gotcha.
Turns out that in patients with lymphedema, surrounding the area that has edema, you always see fat accumulation.
Mm.
It's a typical feature, fat surrounding the area with edema. What this suggested that there was a crosstalk between lymphatics and adipose tissue. And what we think right now is that as lymphatic are defective, they promote fat accumulation. I know we need to round up.
Oh no,
Time
we're
is
good.
over.
That actually, if you don't mind, I'm going to ask something that I really wasn't planning on asking, but you may or may not know the relationship, but there's lymphedema, but there's a lot of individuals, particularly women, that have lipedema.
Correct.
And so there
Yeah.
may be this relationship between one working with the other based on what you said, right?
Yeah, lipedema, and again, I'm not an expert on that, but it's a challenging also type of disease because still today is very few people can really diagnose lipedema.
Mm,
In
right.
many cases, it's confused with obesity. It's not lipedema. So the diagnosis is very difficult. So finding biomarkers for lipedema, it will be an amazing progress because then you can distinguish lymphedema from lipedema. But whether they have common causes, that whether lymphatics may play a role in lipedema, likely, I will say, but not proven yet. So yeah, because especially what happened with lipedema, there are not yet animal models that seem to mimic exactly what happens in lipedema. So it's obviously there is, as you said, mostly in women, so there must be some hormonal component as well. But yeah, many people are working into that as well. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, doctor, I can tell you that your excitement for what you love to do and for your research is evident and how you talk and everything that you presented. And I thank you so very much for your time. And I wanted to ask, is there some final words that you would like to share with any of our listeners today on maybe some of the research that you've got coming up or an event you've got coming up or anything else?
Well, I not much. The only words I will say is that if this help anyone that is listening to somehow become aware of these issues, I feel I accomplished something. I don't expect you remember almost anything I said, but just if you keep in mind the word lymphatics, that's a major accomplishment. I'm sure 90% of the audience was not familiar with this word. Except if you have a patient, a relative, or yourself, you have lymphedema or metastasis, that's the only way you know. And the other more general, and this goes again, I don't know the age range of your audience, but if you're passionate about science, that's the way to go. Science is all about passion. And you said, I'm passionate. Yeah, I am. I love what I do. And as I think people need to support science and embrace and read science. And I was very excited about 2 days ago, the Nobel Prize on the guy that just basically sequenced the Neanderthal DNA. That was exciting. But I think all of this is come from a lot of labs that under many different circumstances are trying to put their best to understand a problem that became much broader than what we all thought about it. And now we have people with this is multidisciplinary, people with many different backgrounds. Let me be clear. We started to work in the heart by accident by these results 3 years ago. I know almost nothing about infarct and anything like that.
Yeah.
When we started and we were doing these assays and doing echo, I couldn't understand much what they were showing to me. And still today, I'm learning. But that's what is fun about it. When you have new questions, you need to learn about it. And hopefully you contribute one way or another to human health. That's what we all want eventually to do. But to your audience, if there is any burning question, they can find me on my online, and happy to address it eventually.
Thank you very much for that. And yes, everyone who's listening, we're gonna put links to some of the material that I talked about before on videos that doctors already done that I think you'll find quite fascinating. Thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in to the Stop Chasing Podcast. We are grateful and honored. We'll see you soon on the other side. Okay, perfect. That was wonderful. Loved it.
Well,
I'm
glad
yeah.
you like.
Oh my God. I'm gonna go back and I'm gonna play that one over and over and over. There's so many great gems in there. Thank you very much.